Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Julie Allen. As we close out 22 and look forward to 23, companies are considering year-end issues and also looking at what they need to plan for that first part of 2023. So to accomplish this big task, I'm joined today by Pat Brown and Wade Sutton to talk about year-end surprises that we think may be coming, and then things that companies should consider when they're planning for that first part of 2023. So Pat and Wade, welcome.
Good to be here, Julie.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to have you. Okay, so we're going to stay in the theme of the holiday season. And so what we're going to talk about is year-end gifts or year-end surprises, and then we'll follow up with New Year's resolutions. So let me start out and ask both of you, as we look toward the end of 2022, what surprises do you think might be coming? And let's start with you first, Pat, and then let's come over to you, Wade.
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk about this from the standpoint of the Hill and maybe outside the U.S., and then maybe Wade can touch on some of the developments potentially at Treasury. From the standpoint of the Hill and the OECD project, I would say across three different parameters, the question is, will they or won't they? I wouldn't necessarily characterize any of these things as surprises because they're very much items that are in play, but we simply don't know the answer. Year-end extenders. Capitol Hill is obviously trying to figure out if they can put together a year-end package. That will not be a year-end tax package by itself. So the gating item that they have to first decide is, will there be year-end legislation? Will there be a year-end appropriations package? And if there is, what sort of tax items might go in that? So all eyes obviously have been on Section 174 for months. As we sit here today, unfortunately in early December, we still don't know the answer to the question, will they or won't they address 174? As we sit here today, maybe it's a 50-50 proposition. Some of the other issues that we've talked about, Section 163J, full expensing for new investment, I would say those things seem a little bit less likely than 174 as we sit here today. So in terms of the Hill and action on the Hill, I think, will they or won't they? We don't know. But we do expect that if anything gets picked up in the tax area, the most likely thing is probably Section 174. But again, we'll have to wait and see. With respect to the OECD project, there's been a lot of back and forth over the last several days, and it continues. Will Hungary sign on to an EU directive, or will they not? As of today, we still don't know. Now, realistically, they've got this week, next week, potentially even into early the following week, which is the week, of course, that ends with Christmas on that Sunday. Will they or won't they? Will Hungary get on board? Will Hungary agree ultimately? And this is obviously where we've been for months and months. We still don't know the answer as we sit here today. So we're just going to have to continue watching and waiting. The last piece to address, guidance from the OECD, technical guidance, the so-called implementation framework. We had been hearing for a while that that was likely to come out right around December 20th, so before the end of the year. Last week, we started to hear that that would slip into early in 2023. Then we started to hear, well, maybe not. Maybe they would actually try and get some of it out in 2022. So it's a great question, Julie. I have no answer for you.
But that was a great answer, covering 174, 163J, the OECD, and Hungary. It's a great answer.
Right.
And I think on the regulatory front from Treasury, we've seen some guidance on the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly in the climate aspects. But the thing I think a lot of taxpayers are waiting for is guidance on the book minimum tax, particularly because there's so many unanswered questions under that provision. And so I just watch the Federal Register closely. There is a chance we might get guidance this month. There are rumors that it's floating around the building and might be out soon, just to answer some of the really basic questions people are struggling with. Like, for example, are split offs subject to the BMT? So hopefully we get something this month that might be ambitious timing because there's a lot of clearance that's involved in that process, but keep your eye out for that too.
And Wade, I think that's a great one because I know in talking with some of the companies that we've been addressing that issue with, that is definitely one that they are looking for some year-end guidance on that. That would be a gift, right? That would be. Okay, I'm going to flip from the gift scenario over to the New Year's resolution scenario to say, what should companies be looking for or planning for in those first few months of 2023? And let's just keep our same order. Pat, if you want to give us your insight, and then Wade will come over to you.
Yeah, so I think for companies, and I'll reflect on sort of my own experience here, we were a calendar year taxpayer in my former role. And so you had year end, calendar year taxpayer, also calendar year from the standpoint of our financials. So year end was an extraordinarily busy time. sort of the starting gun fires, first week in January. And so there's an enormous amount of effort and attention focused on that for companies that are calendar year for GAAP purposes. Less focus and attention, frankly, on the tax return in those very early days, all about closing the books for the year. The other thing that happens early in the year, and my sense is this is true even for companies that don't have the calendar year as their fiscal year, there is beginning of year planning. What are our priorities for the year, right? And that's not driven by the tax function, that's driven by the company, sort of strategic priorities. And that relates to a lot of different things, budgeting for the year, forecasting for the year. All of these sorts of things have to be addressed typically in that early to mid-January period. Those meetings start to happen. One of the real challenges we have as we talk about 2023 is all the things that we've just been talking about that we don't yet have answers to, right? And so to the extent these things slip into 2023, some of them or potentially all of them slip into 2023, how do I think about, if I'm the tax director of a company, how do I think about prioritizing for senior management? What are the things that they need to be focused on? What does my cash flow look like if I don't know the answer to Section 174 yet? That's a huge issue. Yeah. And I can't address that question, with any sort of a definitive response if I don't have the guidance from the Hill, from the Congress with respect to Section 174. Similarly, are we really looking at 2024 rather, and 2025 for the OECD project, or are we not? Well, I may not know the answer to that question for some period of time. So I think a real challenge for companies is, how do I sort of help with the strategic goal setting exercise that I need to be a part of if I'm the tax director, recognizing that there's just so much uncertainty.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, the uncertainty, but also marrying tax decisions with the business side of what they're considering. Wade, what would you add for the planning for that first part of 2023?
Maybe not so much planning, but I think there's going to be a lot of compliance in 2023. There are a number of new provisions that have now come on as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. So, for example, the excise tax and stock buybacks, that's live January 1st, 2023, and there's still a number of unanswered questions about how that provision is going to operate. When do you pay the tax? What transactions are subject to the tax? I think people are going to have to get their arms around that immediately and just come up with their own internal guidelines while they're waiting on guidance. Same thing with the book minimum tax. You're going to need to figure out what your numbers are and whether or not you think you'll be subject to the tax, even in the absence of guidance. So I think companies are maybe short on resources. We're all experiencing a lack of staffing like we would like to have. So you've got to focus where you can, and I think compliance is going to be a big area there.
And you hit some really important points on that compliance and also the excise tax and the unanswered questions and the corporate AMT, all points that, like you said, maybe not planning, but just considering what's going to happen. I think this is very helpful. So Pat and Wade, thank you so much for joining us for the gifts to look for at the end of 22 and also the New Year's resolutions or where we need to think about in 2023. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of our viewers for joining us today, too. And please stay tuned to Policy on Demand for all of your insight on Washington and beyond. Thanks. Take care.